Thanks for joining me for Communication by Design. How many knowledge mobilization frameworks are you aware of? Off the top of your head, I'm guessing you can name 2 or 3. If you think a bit harder, you might be able to come up with 5 or 6. If you've spent any time digging into the scholarship on knowledge mobilization, then you may be able to come up with 10 or 12 or 20 or more. As the authors of this 2024 scoping review point out, the conceptual and theoretical development of our field is outpacing its empirical development. We've gotten really good at inventing and reinventing these sophisticated theoretical constructs, but how much headway are we making in terms of operationalizing those constructs? When you look at the variety of models that are out there, underneath all of them we see a basic logic model that works something like this. We have our inputs, the research findings. From those we manufacture outputs, and from there we hope that the outputs will lead to outcomes. What is happening between inputs and output? What is the mysterious process that is ensuring that the outputs are going to yield the outcomes? What should be happening in that in-between space, I'd argue, is a design process. Design, as you see here, is a discipline of study and practice that focuses on the interaction between a person or a user and the artificial environment. And it takes into account a whole range of factors: aesthetic, functional, contextual, cultural, and societal considerations. When we don't use design to craft our knowledge mobilization outputs, we end up disappointed. We end up with the equivalent of the coffee pot for masochists, which you see featured here on Don Norman's seminal work on interaction design. As you can see, the coffee pot is a kind of pottery pun, but it aptly represents what happens when a designer fails to take into account that interactive relationship between the object and the user. Carolyn Miller, you may know, is someone who was a pioneer in what's called genre theory. So thinking about the different ways that form and function come together to make texts effective in their environment. Her doctoral work, I recently learned, focused on what I would call a failed, poorly designed knowledge mobilization product. She studied the environmental impact statements that were commissioned by the U.S. Congress in 1969, and apparently they were a huge flop. Miller says that was for 2 reasons. First, there was no satisfactory fusion of substance and form. The environmental impact statement was a new kind of knowledge product. It just didn't really make sense to the people who needed to use it to make decisions. Sounds like poor design to me. Miller also says the statements had no coherent pragmatic force. And I think that idea of pragmatic force is such a beautiful way of thinking about the way we want our knowledge products to drive impact. That calls for smart design. Together we're going to explore the design difference. I'll introduce you to the basic steps in the design process, and we'll look at some challenges and remedies. The challenges and remedies I have lived personally through my experience as a communications consultant and as an e-learning designer working with innovative technology. The design difference means taking into account the way the user interacts with whatever object we're creating. Years ago, before interaction design really took off as a field, we might have thought of design as form enabling function. But when you start thinking about the way design really works or doesn't work, that definition is inadequate because it leaves out the user. I first learned about interaction design when I taught computer science students at Dalhousie University communication skills. in preparing for the class, I did a lot of background reading, trying to learn about the world of computing. And one of the books I dug into was Alan Cooper's The Inmates Are Running the Asylum. This is a great introduction to the kind of thinking and processes that go into creating graphical user interfaces for computers. And I found this fascinating and so very relevant to communication, because when you think about it, when we're creating those knowledge products, they are really serving as an interface of sorts between our ideas and the knowledge user. So with this fresh lens, I came to understand that design means nothing if you aren't putting the audience first and thinking about the audience not in an abstract way, but very concretely, thinking about their outer world and their inner world. One of the exercises I used to do with technology consultants was to ask them to design an underwater book. It became very clear immediately that we couldn't just put a book in a baggie, that we would need, given the environmental considerations, to completely rethink the kind of object we were creating to convey the content. And that's the kind of thinking that it's essential to bring to any kind of design of a knowledge mobilization product. Really get to know your audience in situ. You also want to consider their inner world, their emotional response. We spend a lot of time figuring out how we can help people understand our research, but we need to think about the emotional barriers that could be preventing them from understanding something, even if it's spelled out very plainly. Do they live in a stressful world where it's like they're fighting one fire after another? Do they feel isolated and alone and unsupported, like they're on an ice floe? Are they disengaged? Are they just checked out mentally, like they're already on the beach on vacation? Only once you have this deep insight into your audience are you ready to embark on the design process. And it works like this. This is a process that can work, by the way, with any kind of communication that you're doing as part of your knowledge mobilization activities. Could be that you are designing a physical product or a digital product, or you could be designing a meeting or an event. You want to identify the real problem, which may not always be the first problem that presents. Then you want to consult with the audience and figure out what it is the ideal solution will enable them to do. So typically you don't ask the audience right away, what would you like, a video or an infographic? But you try to figure out what is it that this knowledge product needs to enable them to do. Even if you think you're building awareness, I would challenge you to frame your objectives, your outcomes in more active ways. Are you just building awareness, or are you trying to empower someone to shift their perspective? Do you want to enable them to make a more informed decision? Then recognize the constraints. We all are in situations where we wish we had more time and more money, but a designer will tell you that once you recognize the constraints, that's when you get creative. Think about how Twitter transformed the way we communicate. When Twitter first came out, we all thought 140 characters, we will never be able to communicate that way. And then look at how creative people got. Envision multiple versions of the solution. This is a key part of the design process. If you've ever worked with a graphic designer, then you've probably experienced this phenomenon for yourself. If you're designing something simple like a logo, for instance, typically the designer will present 3 to 5 versions so that you can say, oh, I like this, I don't like that, I like this color, I like this shading, and that is the quickest route forward. You have to get comfortable with the notion of creative waste. Then you're able to choose the best solution. And only when you have multiple options can you be sure that you're getting to the best solution. From there, you then create the solution. Of course, you test it with the audience and you get feedback, and then you iterate as necessary. So what are some of the challenges and the remedies that come up as you work through the design process? Well, number one, as we've seen, the first problem that presents probably isn't the real problem. Let me share with you a recent example. I was speaking with a client who is a large organization with more than 10,000 employees, and they'd recently had some issues rolling out a new HR form to support one of their standard HR processes. They were concerned about getting people to comply, to fill out the new form, so they had a detailed 90-day communication plan that included things like emails and posters and lunch and learns and online resources and so on. When they rolled the form out, they didn't get the compliance they wanted. So I was curious and I said, gee, that's a lot of training to fill out a form. Is it hard to fill out the form? And they said, well, no, that's a really frustrating thing. Anybody who can place an order on Amazon can fill out this form. And that's when my comment to them was, I wonder if you were designing for the real problem. The real problem here was clearly not a technology problem. It was not a knowledge problem. It was a problem with buy-in into the HR process itself. So the solution here is to focus on the outcomes you want to achieve rather than the outputs. So if the outcome is that you want more people to complete this process, then focus on that and look at all of the different possible barriers that could be getting in the way of that, rather than just jumping to the conclusion of new form equals new training. Of course, to get to that root cause, you're going to need to do a lot of audience consultation, and I know many of you watching this will be using integrated approaches to knowledge mobilization. Learn to ask smart questions and practice deep listening. To get to deep listening, you will have to ask questions that enable you to understand your audience in ways that are not just cognitive. So the questions you're going to ask will get at things like what their daily life is like and what are some of the issues that come up. And of course, you may not be able to ask these questions right off the top of your interview script. There's an art to building enough trust that you can get this information. Another challenge is that different people have different perspectives, and it takes a diverse team to create a sophisticated product that makes things complicated. In fact, in Norman's 25th year anniversary issue of the Design of Everyday Things, he did a complete rewrite so that he could talk a lot more about what is involved in actually making design happen, because so much of it is project management, stakeholder management, team communication. The key here is to create an intentional culture of collaboration. That means thinking through the ground rules. How do you play together in the sandbox you are creating? Thinking about your processes and your systems and your communication. These are all essential elements if you want to be able to do design work effectively. And finally, I mentioned earlier this notion of creative waste. The desire for productivity and efficiency, which is generally a good thing, can kill creativity. So there's a fine balance between creating the ultimate Gantt chart to keep the team on track and allowing lots of room for surprises and detours and learning. I hope this has been helpful to you. I encourage you to connect with me on LinkedIn, and you may also want to sign up for my weekly newsletter, which contains tips and insights to help make your everyday work as a knowledge mobilizer more effective and impactful.